Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels, and today I'm sharing the third card in my Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous Fall Halloween Curation series, a grungy jack-o'-lantern card featuring classic Tim Holtz stamps and stencils. This project is all about building layers of texture and inky grunge, starting with a distressed background and finishing with a bold jack-o'-lantern focal point. If you love mixed media techniques with a spooky twist, you're going to enjoy this one. Once again, I'm going to be using some of the stamps and stencils from the Stampers Anonymous September Curation with Tim Holtz, where they're reminding us of some of the older designs from Tim that are still available and perfect for fall and Halloween crafting. So you may already have these in your stash, or they may be new to you, which, I'll be honest, I only had a few of these stamp sets myself, and so most of these were new to me. So it was really exciting for me to have the opportunity to get to create and play with them, and then of course share that with you. So the stencil I'm going to be working with is called Twisted, and this is available in the mini set 23. There is also a larger one of this as well. And then the stamp sets I've got here are Mini Halloween 3 and Mini Halloween 2 and Mini Halloween. So what I liked about all of these sets is they've got just the smaller images that are perfect for doing collage stamping, which is something that I absolutely love doing. So I used a variety of images from all of these stamp sets. Not all the stamps on each set, but specifically I like ones that kind of have a little bit more open space to them, like this spider web and this little text piece and the label and kind of the same thing on here with the skeleton and this owl with the scroll design. And then on this one, again, the label and the little calendar piece. You could also maybe not even use this stamp set and only use these two, or maybe you have some other Halloween stamps that kind of have similar style that you would want to use. Of course, all of this said, if you're not into Halloween, you could certainly switch this out and use this technique for other projects. However, I will say that I feel like the finished technique that I created on this background definitely lends itself to kind of a spooky Halloween vibe. And then along with the stamps and stencils, I'm also going to be using the jack-o'-lantern die set and the cracked embossing folder. This is going to be used to create the focal embellishment on the card. I'm not going to go through assembling this, but I will go into how I created it in the video. If you don't have the jack-o'-lantern die, any sort of die would work as far as creating something that you can use as a focal point, or you can just use a large sentiment die or whatever. And then if you don't have this larger A5 size, there is the original cracked embossing folder, and you could use that instead. And then to add a little bit more texture to this card, I'm also going to be using some mummy cloth. And as far as a substitute for that, maybe you've got some other similar type materials in your craft stash that you could use instead, or you could certainly skip this step. These are the mediums I'm going to be working with. I'm going to be using black soot archival ink, so you just need some sort of waterproof ink. I'm going to have some embossing ink and the Distress Embossing Glaze and peeled paint. This could be substituted with any color that you prefer. I've got some crackle paste opaque, and then I've got Distress ink and black soot and wild honey, and then several different spray inks that I'm going to be using. So on the background for the card, I'm going to be using Twisted Citron and Shabby Shutters. These other spray inks are what I used on the embellishment for the card with the jack-o'-lantern. So I used Rusty Hinge, Wild Honey, Peeled Paint, and Black Soot. And then one other thing I'm also going to be using is a Distress Crayon and Black Soot. And then the paper I'm going to be using for this card is Distress Watercolor cardstock, and then just plain black cardstock for the base. You can replace the Distress Watercolor cardstock with any kind of watercolor paper you might have, or any kind of paper that you can use with wet mediums such as spray inks. So then with the jack-o'-lantern here, what I did is took some distressed watercolor cardstock and I just sprayed it like one panel with rusty hinge, added a little water, dried it, and then used that to die cut the main layers of the jack-o'-lantern. Then I did one with wild honey and used that to do the little detail pieces. And then I used some peeled paint for the stem on the jack-o'-lantern. And then on the base layer of it, I used the black soot. And then I took that paper and actually, after I die cut it, I embossed it with the cracked embossing folder to just add some more texture inside the jack-o'-lantern. The other thing I did is I took some mummy cloth and I custom colored it with the black soot spray stain. So I just sprayed a length of the mummy cloth with the spray and then dried it with my heat tool, but you could also just set it to the side and let it dry as well. I then cut up that piece and just into little pieces and kind of frayed it and then tucked it in behind the jack-o'-lantern and popped it all up with some double-sided foam tape just to give it a little bit more dimension. So to get started, I've got a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. Of course, you could cut it to whatever size you would like. And I've got the twisted stencil that's from mini set 23, but you could also use the larger one of these if that's all you have, or a totally different stencil, or of course, if you're not into Halloween, you could definitely use these techniques with a different theme. So first off, what I've got here is some of the Distress Crackle Paste Opaque. So this is going to add some really cool crackle texture to the background. So I've just got some on my palette knife here and I'm just going to apply it through the stencil, kind of in this upper corner here of my paper. And kind of down along this side a little bit. Now the center is going to be getting covered with my focal point image, so I'm not going to worry about getting paste here in the middle, but I do want to kind of get it along that edge there. Now I'll just carefully pick that up. Then I'm going to flip this around, but first I'm going to get a little more paste on my knife here so I'm ready to go. And I'm going to repeat that over here in this bottom corner. And just kind of using my fingers to hold it up off the paper. So this stencil can be a little bit flimsy, so when you're putting the paste on there, you want to kind of work in the direction of the design so that you're not accidentally getting it under the stencil. And then just kind of going slow and steady with the application. And then lift that off. There we go. And then if you had gotten it anywhere that maybe you didn't want it, you can always just kind of wipe off that a little bit with your fingers. And then we're going to set this to the side and let this dry. You don't want to try to speed up the drying process with the crackle paste. You want to just let it do its thing and dry naturally, otherwise it just doesn't want to crackle. And after about 10 minutes, here is just a look at the progress with the crackling and drying that we're getting. So just depending on the humidity and temperature and all that where you live, the paste will dry slower or faster, or also how thickly you applied it. It's going to dry slower, obviously, if it's thicker. So just again, give it time to dry. So now that crackle paste is dry, I'm going to take that stencil and line it back up over the texture pasted areas. And I'm going to apply some embossing ink through the stencil. Now, I know there are people that, I think Stacy Hutchison has shared where, and Tim has too, where they pour the embossing glaze on the wet paste. And I just do not have good luck with that sticking to the paste. So I find that if I just do the paste, let it crack, and then come back and ink over it with some embossing ink, that I just get a better result. That's just been my experience. I tend to think it maybe has something to do with the humidity or something maybe. I'm not sure. So now I'm going to pour some of the peeled paint embossing glaze over the top of this. And you can use whatever color you want. This just happens to be the one I picked to kind of go with my color palette. And then I'm going to take my heat gun and heat emboss this. And so there is what it looks like heat embossed. And then I'm just going to repeat that same process on this other corner here. So now we have all of our embossing glaze heat embossed, and we're ready for the next step. So now we're going to add some spray ink, and I'm going to be working with the Twisted Citron Oxide Spray and the Shabby Shutters Distress Spray Stain. Obviously you could switch out colors and use different colors and kind of make it fit whatever theme you're going for. And I'm just going to make sure I get this shaken up really well, get all that pigment mixed in. And I'm just going to get some of that color down there. And now add a little bit of the Shabby Shutters. And get that little spritz of some water just to kind of blend some things together there. And then we'll dry that with our heat tool. Now if you want it less speckledy, just add more water. Get that color blended, or you can leave it kind of speckledy. I'm going to leave it a little speckledy on this one. And then some of those bigger drips and stuff, you can kind of use your fingers to break up, or you can tilt it and let it kind of run and move around a little bit, create some drips and interest that way. And then when you're drying it with the heat tool, with that, you know, having done the heat embossing, just remember you're kind of reheating that embossing powder, so just make sure you're kind of keeping it back and not holding it in one spot for too long. You kind of keep that heat tool moving over the surface. You can also just let this sit to the side and dry if you would prefer. And so then once our spray ink is dry, we're going to move on to the next step with some stamping. Now, if you want to use a stamping block for this, you can. And I'm going to work on a grip mat here just to kind of help hold the paper in place while I'm doing some of the stamping. And then I'm going to be using that archival ink. So, and I'm just going to take some of these images here and ink them up. And then I'm going to just figure out where I want to position them. And just kind of use my fingers to help kind of push them down. I find that with using my fingers, I can kind of get it down and around that texture that we've created with the paste, because that kind of raises it up a little bit so it's not an even surface to stamp on. So being able to push a little bit harder in areas because I'm using my fingers does kind of help there. But I'm just kind of stamping and thinking about filling in some of those spots. There we go. And like I said, just kind of using a mix of different stamps here. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Not necessarily going for perfect stamping here. Just wanting to add a little interest here and there. I'm going to do a little bit with this script stamp. There we go. And this little label here. As you can see, I'm just kind of picking random stamps that just kind of have like thinner detail to them to fill in here. maybe a little bit more right there. I'll just use this other little label. And we'll take this little script one again and use that stamp right in there. There we go. And then as far as cleaning off like these grip mates, I find that you can just use one of the, like a clear stamp cleaner, and that'll get off most of the ink if you do it soonish. You just have to give it a little scrub. Now that ink is actually not ink, that's the printing that's on the stencils. These grip mates are so sticky, especially when you first get them, that they will peel off that print from those stencils. So just a little FYI if you lay the printed side down on here. But other than that, good to go for the next time. And then from here, we're just going to ink the edges with a little bit of some Wild Honey and Black Soot Distress inks. So I'm just going to take a blending brush and just kind of work that around the edges here. And then I'm going to take a this kind of a blending brush, because that one I kind of wanted the color kind of to come towards the center a little bit more. This I just want to do a little bit around the edges, so I'm just going to just rub it along the edges here to get a little bit more harsh. It still kind of softer, but a little more harsh, but detailed kind of edging there. And then you could also kind of go back in and blend over that a little bit more if you wanted to kind of make it a little bit softer between those two. And then the final step here is, if you wanted to add in any more inking of any kind, if you wanted to add in like some water splatters, you could kind of go back in. I would think I'm going to do a little bit of that in here, especially. I feel like that's just kind of not much excitement going on there. And then give this a dry. And alrighty, so now the final step. You could certainly leave it as is, but I want to grunge it up a little bit more, and I'm going to be using the Black Soot Distress Crayon to do that. Now there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can color it directly onto the paper, or you can, put some onto your craft mat, and you add a little water. And then I'm using just a small stencil brush. This is kind of similar to the bristles that are in the blending brushes from Tim. It's just, this is a little bit smaller, and I feel like I can kind of control it a little bit better, especially with what I'm wanting to do here on this kind of smaller design. So like I said, you can put some onto the craft mat, or you can just kind of color it in on the design, and then just kind of get it damp and use that to kind of blend it around in there. Now it is going to get onto the paper around there because, again, this brush is larger than the surface. So it's definitely going to give you a kind of creepy dark effect there. If you want, you could also use your finger to kind of blend it in a little bit. I don't really like getting it on my fingers. That's just a personal preference. But just kind of helps bring out some of that design and the depth in the crackle from the crackle paste. So a little more water there. I don't want it too wet though. So if it's getting too wet, you can kind of wipe it off on a paper towel. And, you know, if it's a little bit too dark, you can always kind of go back and just kind of rub off a little bit of it too. If you want to kind of back it down a little bit, but like there you can kind of see one side with it versus not having it on there. So again, like it's kind of a personal preference. If you like the effect that gives. But like I said, it definitely adds to like the grungy, kind of creepy effect for this card by adding that crayon. And I'm just gonna repeat that on the other side and finish off the background. And just keep in mind, like this does not need to be perfect. So if you're getting more black on here than you were thinking, it's all good. Especially if you're kind of going for a little Halloween effect here. Tap it down a little bit, you can. But then there is a look at our finished background. And then the only other thing I did was just added some machine stitching around the outer edge. And yes, I do stitch through paste. So the needle I use when I'm sewing is a needle that's used with denim. So it's a little bit thicker needle and it will go right through the paste. Now that said, you do need to make sure you clean out your sewing machine. If you are doing it through that sort of thing, and just kind of make sure you keep it dusted out on the inside so that it doesn't clog up anything on the inside of the machine. To finish off the card, I used this Happy Halloween stamp from the Mini Halloween 3, and I stamped it in archival ink onto some white cardstock and fussy cut it, and then inked the edges with a little bit of some pumice stone and black soot distress ink, and then adhered that to the card along with some of the mummy cloth in the center, and then added the jack-o'-lantern. I hope you had fun watching this card come together with all its layers of inky texture and grungy goodness. If you missed the other tutorials in this series, be sure to check out my Spooky Skull card and Haunted House card for even more ideas with the Fall Halloween Curation. You can find the links in the description box below. If you're interested in any of the products I'm using, you'll find links to all of them in the description box below, along with the visual supply list for a quick look at everything. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe for more crafty inspiration, tips, and techniques. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.